Good morning, everyone. For some of you, good evening for those of you watching today, and welcome to another edition of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. I just want to remind you guys, if you haven't done it already, hit that like button. If you're not subscribers, hit the subscribe button. I was on Majority Report yesterday talking about Gen X shit. Sam Cedar. It was a good time. Hope you guys tuned in and watched it. Where is Jason, you ask? I am in a hotel, and I am in California. I'm in Monterey, California, with Phoenix, who might make an appearance on the show. So we'll see. So let me bring in my homie, my co-host, my dog, Mr. Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles, live from Monterey, California. Happy Saturday, everyone. And glad to see you there. Here, I should say.
Yeah, this was, I did not take the large computer. I'm trying something new. So I'll probably be off air for a lot of this show, doing production stuff in the back. And we have to bring this gentleman in. I usually make a joke about him being the only black guy that lived in Maine, but I'm not going to do that today. Marcus of the left flank.
Number one nonchalant supporter of Terry McAuliffe here. Just
That's a big admission there, buddy.
Whenever they get my poll here to my doorstep, I might fill it out. But I don't feel like going outside to do it. He doesn't really inspire that much. So
That's a big admission there, buddy. Whoa.
that was just jokes.
I will hope so.
Yeah. No. Who's it? Princess Balding. That's who's got the governor vote for me.
LME says Google says Maine has 1.7% black people. That was Marcus and his beige children.
It's 1.5 now.
And let us bring in our guest. Pascal, would you like to introduce our guest today? This is a show that you wanted to do, so I'm excited for this one.
We have today Professor Hudis, who is a scholar and academic intellectual who has written a book on the subject of Frantz Fanon, who will be discussing the significance of Frantz Fanon and his legacy with us today on This is Revolution podcast. So we would like to welcome, please, Professor Hudis.
Dr. Peter Hudis.
Thank you very much. I would just only add one thing: is I'm more of an activist than an academic, frankly. And that's where my interest in Fenan came out of. But sure, I'll take the title of professor once in a while.
We've been wanting to do. It's interesting. So we started doing this. Well, I started doing this show. It's been 2 years. The anniversary actually passed, the 2-year anniversary. We didn't even do anything for it, guys. How horrible are we? And the last, I would say, 3 or 4 months, I've been getting a lot of people sending me messages saying you should do a show on Fenan. You should do a show on Fenan. And Pascal had wanted to talk to somebody about Fenan from a different perspective, because I think the perspective of Fenan that people are getting right now is more from the Afro pessimist angle. And when we came across your book, Jean Bajlan, who's a part of the show, sent us your book, and we all kind of was like, oh wow, this is awesome. We gotta get this guy on the show. So we kind of ran as quickly as we could to try to get you on. I wish we could have got you on earlier, but you know, I'm very happy to have you here now. So this is my way of saying thank you for coming on, first and foremost. And for those that don't know who Frantz Fanon is, Dr. Hudis, why is Fanon still an influential character somewhat 60 years later, in your opinion?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that he is the foremost thinker on issues of race and racism from a philosophical as well as a political perspective that were working in the 20th century, or certainly the second half of the 20th century. And he's somebody who combines a political, philosophical, and psychoanalytical approach to the problem of racism. So he's somebody who is neither somebody who is ignoring the socioeconomic, political ramifications of racism, nor is he somebody who's simply looking at those aspects and not dealing with the inner psychic life of racism. What impact does it have on the human psyche, both in terms of the perpetrators of racism and, of course, most of all, the victims of racial discrimination? So he has this remarkable ability, plus on top of that, an amazingly beautiful writer who came out of the Negritude movement of the 1940s and 50s and has this beautiful poetic expressionist prose about way of expressing himself. So he's a literary figure, he's a political figure, he's a philosophical figure, and he's made an important contribution to the field of psychiatry in terms of focusing on the psychodynamics of racism. So he's a very unique sort of character. I think he particularly, however, is important because we use today as almost like a phrase, like a cliche. Race is not a biological construct, but a phenomenon, but it's a social construction. And we can talk more through this interview about how well people understand that concept and what they mean by it, because a lot of people mean different things by it. But there's no question that Fanon, it kind of crossed a conceptual threshold in putting forth exactly this idea that arguing against any essentialist concept of race and arguing that race is constructed at a particular moment of European history, the European imaginary. It arises out of specific economic motives, but then it takes a life of its own and invades the life world of Western culture and society as a whole. And that the only way to rid ourselves of racism is by transforming the fundamental fabric of human relations. Simply doing some piecemeal political reforms, or simply trying to aim for self-expression or a safe place in which to develop our passions and our interests, that's not enough. And Fanon, because he had this revolutionary approach rooted in what we call a sociogenic approach to problems of race and racism, he has taken on much greater resonance in the last number of years. And he's being appropriated now, I think, in a much more fruitful and healthy manner, more conducive to his own, the motivations of his own philosophical outlook on the part of many people, not all, but on the part of many people, than you might have had when he was kind of boxed into academia in the 1990s and considered kind of this fellow in post-colonial theory, which I think Fanon would feel rather uncomfortable in because his aspiration was to seek a revolutionary transformation of the world. And I think now that we're seeing the necessity of that as an urgency for the very continuance of civilization, his revolutionary approach to trying to address and resolve the problems of racial discrimination takes on a lot of substance and sustenance.
You mentioned the French Negritude movement and how that influenced Fanon. Would you consider that like a proto-Black Power movement? And can you also go into your kind of critiques or Fanon's hesitations or critiques of that movement?
Yeah, I'm not sure you would call it a Black Power movement as much as a kind of a variant of the Harlem Renaissance among French-speaking Black intellectuals in the Black diaspora. So it emerges in the 1940s under his high school teacher, Aimé Césaire, who is, of course, one of the greatest literary voices of the 20th century in his own right, major political and social figure. And it included a great number of other people, not only the very famous figures, but there's a number of women who are associated with the Negritude movement who are now getting increased attention. It was a Black Pride movement, cultural movement, dealing with art and culture, and it's interested in issues of psychology and literary expression. And it had radical tendencies to a certain degree, because don't forget, in the 1940s in the French Caribbean or in West Africa, to proclaim Black is beautiful, right, or to affirm the dignity of the individual, regardless of their racial characteristics, was itself a revolutionary step. That was certainly something that was out of the norm. And Fanon was influenced by Negritude. I would have to say he was most influenced by their style of writing, especially Amy Césaire's writing, which has its own fluidity and beauty about it. And he certainly thought it was a necessary step in reclaiming pride on the part of those who are discriminated against because of their skin color. And so he sees it, at least certainly initially, as an important way to battle the inferiority complex. Now, the inferiority complex is something all oppressed people experience in one way or another. In other words, every human being, Fanon argues, strives for some type of recognition from the other. You want the dignity of your humanity to be acknowledged by other people. I mean, you see this in children from the youngest age. You see this people throughout their lives is striving for some sort of recognition and acknowledgement of who they are as humans, as individuals. And of course, racism blocks that recognition because the racist sees the person of color not as a person, but as an embodiment of an abstract category or as a thing, okay? So inferiority complex comes in at that moment. You want recognition from the other, and yet you're blocked recognition from the master class. So then it's a natural first reaction to say, it's my fault. If I was only less black, if I was only less Jewish, if I was only less queer, if I was only less this or that, then I would be accepted by the mainstream society. Because who wants to live completely as an outsider to the mainstream, initially at least? And Negritude was at voicing that sort of black pride in reaction against the tendency towards an inferiority complex, which has a lot to do with his first book. After all, it's entitled, it wasn't his title, by the way, but the publisher gave it the title, Black Skin, White Masks, which is about that. But Fanon, even in Black Skin, White Masks, is drawing criticisms of Negritude because there is a phenomenon that I think whether he got it from Hegel or not, I don't know, but it resonates with a concept in Hegel called spirit and self-estrangement. In his phenomenology, Hegel, German philosopher in the early 1800s, had this really brilliant discussion of how you can oppose something. He's critiquing the European Enlightenment in this regard. You can oppose something like irrationalism, like the Enlightenment did. But if you accept the terms by which your opponent frames issues, then actually in opposing your opponent, you reconstruct the very terms of reference of that opponent, and therefore you lose to their argument. And one thing that Fanon sees in terms of this is Negritude wants to capture Black pride, but it falls into a kind of essentialism. It wants to assume that there's a unified entity called the Black subject, regardless of class distinctions, regardless of national differences, regardless of historical differentiation, etc. And there's a particular phrase that Senghor, Leopold Senghor, who later becomes, of course, the first president of independent Senegal, was an important figure in the Negritude movement and a significant poet in his own right, made in one of his works where he uses the phrase, emotion is as Negro as reason is Greek.
Yeah.
So, rejecting Western rationalism in the name of a kind of Black essentialism that, well, we can dance, they can't, okay? Mm-hmm. Well, Fanon is he quotes that, and he's ambivalent about it, right? On the one hand, he sees where he's coming from in Black Skin, White Mask. On the other hand, he's, well, wait a second, what is this? Is this just the opposite sides of the same coin? Are we buying into the stereotype and then in a way that's, even though we're trying to use it against the oppressor, in a way that implicates us in the ideology of the oppressor? And so I'm not sure if Fanon knew this or not, but that phrase is actually paraphrased from Gobineau, who was one of the arch theorists of European racism. George Lukács has a chapter in one of his books, The Destruction of Reason, written in 1947, where he actually has a discussion of Gobineau's very comment that Senghor probably unwittingly picked it up, didn't realize where he was getting it from. So that is kind of the things that made Fanon, even from early on, troubled to some degree about where Negritude was going. But once he gets to Africa, and once he joins the revolutionary movement for Algerian and African independence in 1954, Fanon becomes very critical of Negritude because he says, okay, you're still discussing all these cultural issues and, a Black essential unity, etc. Where are you on the barricades, right? In other words, now Senghor is leading the independence struggle in Senegal, but Senghor is now compromising with French imperialism. He's willing to be part of the French community, right, which is kind of neo-colonial enterprise established as African countries are becoming politically independent. And even Aimé Césaire, who he admired immensely, and was a communist, by the way, member of the Communist Party for many, many years, opposes independence for Martinique, his homeland. So Fanon begins to see that Negritude does not have the kind of revolutionary content that was necessary. And by the time we get to, let's say, 1958, 1959, various conferences that he speaks at, he actually shocks the Negritude delegates by getting, but followers of Negritude are at the conference. He gets up and he says, you know, you guys ain't doing anything for the revolutionary struggle in terms of where do you stand on the question of violence? Where do you stand on the question of extending the revolution beyond the stage of bourgeois democratic leadership? And when they cannot respond to those sort of politicized radical demands that he's putting forth, he bids his adieu to Negritude.
Now, Peter, you also write that in this time for Fanon, a lot of communists were okay with some of the imperialism that was going on in Africa, and that was a reason why Fanon kind of pushed back against the idea of Marxism.
Well, that's part of the reason. The Communist Party of France, despite its so-called Leninist origins, or Lenin's inclinations in terms of Lenin himself, of course, fiercely opposed colonialism and denounced it, and is very famous for having added 3 words, you can say, to the Communist Manifesto. Marx said, workers of the world unite. Lenin added 3 little words, and colonized peoples, right? And that's what made him famous in the developing world for many, many decades, okay? But despite that background, by the 1940s, the French Communist Party, becoming thoroughly Stalinist, was hostile to independent movements in Africa. People forget that the Soviet Union did not support African liberation movements until much later. Stalin attacked Nkrumah as a stooge of British imperialism in the 1950s, right? So did other Soviet leaders. They switched when they began to realize that, well, in the struggle for the Cold War, we should win these newly independent African states over to our side. And that's when they got more interested in Africa. So the French Communist Party, following the Moscow line, aside from the fact that they imbibed an awful lot of racist and colonialist assumptions, which much of the labor movement did, certainly the Socialist Party was no better than the Communist Party. The Socialist Party actually directly was part of the government at one point and actually directly participated in the suppression of the Algerian Revolution. So Stalinism and these tendencies that dominated Marxism, unfortunately, from the late 1920s onward, there were periods and there were communist parties in certain parts of the world which did important anti-racist work. We can talk about the U.S. Communist Party in this regard, but it always followed the lines of Moscow's foreign policy. So even like the American Communist Party did very, very important work, let's say from the mid-20s to the late 30s, especially in fighting racism. But when the Popular Front came in 1937, the idea that, well, communists have to unite with bourgeois liberals and whoever else in order to fight fascism, then the black struggle was put on the back burner. And as many of you know, in 1943, when the Harlem Riots breaks out, the Communist Party denounces it and actually supports the Smith Act at first, that prosecuted those independent Marxists who were solidarizing with those sort of struggles of the black masses. And then the Smith Act was then later used against the communists. So the point here is that, yes, Fanon is living through all of this, and he's quite disgusted with the French communists and socialists. Now, there are other Marxists and Marxist tendencies in France. We know for a fact that when he went to Lyon, he was attending meetings of Trotskyist organizations. My own mentor, Raya Dunayevskaya, founder of Marxist Humanism, was herself at the time a Trotskyist and was in Lyon in the 1940s. And she was convinced that Fanon was sitting in the audience when she was giving a speech one time. And we have other evidence that he was associating with various figures who were in the left of the communist and socialist parties. But even those tendencies had not worked out a theory of racialization. They did not have a developed politics of how to combat racism. I wouldn't say they were class reductionist, all of them, but they had a strong tendency in that direction. And that was not something that Fanon, that didn't speak to his lived experience. So Fanon never called himself a Marxist. That doesn't mean that he wasn't deeply influenced by Marxist currents, and especially by Marx, which he read. We know he read especially the early Marx, the 1844 manuscripts, pretty early in life when he was like 21, 22 years old. And it no doubt made a lasting impression on him. After all, originally the title of Black Skin, White Masks is a theory on the disalienation of the black man. Well, alienation, of course, central to the 1844 manuscripts. So it's so that it, but at the same time, I think we shouldn't assume that Fanon was completely outside the Marxist tradition as well, because if we'll get to talk about a lot of things that he develops in his later work, especially Wretched of the Earth, is directly confronting one of the central debates within Marxist theory, and that is, how do you make a revolution in a technologically underdeveloped society and not fall victim to the powers of either imperialism, colonialism, or a bourgeois nationalist stage of development in which a fundamental social transformation doesn't actually ensue. And Fanon is drawing from a lot of debates within the Marxist movement and staking out his own position on this in The Wretched of the Earth. He doesn't always tell you that, but he has no reason to tell you that because he's working it out in his own terms, in terms of his own vocabulary. But there's no question that there's a whole background of debates within Marxist theory that he was immersed in, and there were Marxist tendencies within the FLN that he was active in that he certainly was engaged in a continuous discussion with.
Professor Hudis, I really want to thank you for this expository you're sharing with us on Fanon, which for me, as a child of the French Caribbean, my parents are from Haiti, and I'm also familiar with the influence the Haitian Revolution had on Fanon, and have been reading Fanon since my teenage years. I mean, this first book that I read was Black Skin, White Mask, and Wretched of the Earth is something I studied in college as well. So there's a lot of ground I'd like to cover with you in terms of Fanon here, but one of the things that we'd like to discuss is you explaining Fanon's concept on his new humanism and his developing a kind of way to transcend race and racism by developing a new version of humanism. Can you elaborate for us in terms of what the influences were on that and what he meant by that conception?
Right. Great question. Well, by new humanism, first of all, it's distinguished from an old humanism. So what's the old humanism? The old humanism is the humanism, you can say, of the Renaissance and European Enlightenment, which, as Fanon states famously in The Wretched of the Earth, Europe, which knows how to talk about man so well, massacres man wherever he can find him. So humanism, in a certain veneer, in a certain vocabulary, that is in the part of mainstream European thought. And we have to understand, by the way, neither the Enlightenment nor the Renaissance nor rationalism was ever the mainstream tendency in European thought. I mean, this is a point which I'm hopefully will make in my next book more effectively than I have in the past. Irrationalism and anti-rationalism is the most important, and unfortunately the most important, legacy of Western civilization. We should not by any means assume that the West owns rationalism and the East does not, because that's absurd. But in any case, the point is that there is a certain strain within Western thought that it advances a kind of humanism, which is abstract and which actually could be counterproductive in the sense of defining the human in a certain way that conforms to that which is white, conforms to that which corresponds to a kind of imperialistic organization of society, etc. And anyone who stands outside of that definition of the so-called human becomes inhuman, and therefore you can kill them much more easily, right? Fanon was certainly aware that that type of humanism was something that he viciously didn't like, viciously opposed and certainly didn't like. So what's the new humanism? Well, Marx himself calls himself a new humanist, and calls himself a humanist, doesn't use the word new humanism, but he calls himself a thoroughgoing humanist in his early writings on alienation in 1844, which, as I mentioned, there's no question that Fanon read, studied, and knew of. And what did Marx mean by that? Well, Marx meant that, well, what's the target of an anti-capitalist revolution? Most Marxists would try to tell you, well, it's the existence of private property, the free market, class inequality, etc. But you can make an argument, as I do in my book on Marx, that actually Marx's critique of capital goes much deeper than that. Although he opposes all those things, he opposes them because they're expressions of alienated, dehumanized human relationships. So unless you transform the very fabric of human relationships at the base, in terms of the conditions and relations of everyday life, beginning with the point of production, the workplace, but not ending there by any means, unless you transform alienated human relationships, you don't end up with a truly new society. You can replace private property by nationalized property, a free market with a planned economy, but you haven't ended class oppression. Well, for Fanon, who's well aware of this, neither does it even touch the question of racial discrimination. You can have a welfare state, and I'm all for one, as at least against those who are trying to destroy it. But let's be frank, having a more expansive welfare state is not going to uproot the deep-rooted racialized and racist ways of seeing that define modernity. Much more fundamental uprooting is needed. So what kind of uprooting is needed? Well, you certainly have to change the social, political, economic structures of existing society. But Fanon is interested in the test or the measure of to extent to which they've been transformed has to do with how, one, the way we see each other is transformed. The assumptions we have when we gaze upon the other is radically altered and transformed. Because all of us, certainly white Americans more than most others in the world, are simply schooled from a very, very early age to view those people of color in a dehumanizing way, or certainly in a stereotypical way. So if that is not changed, if that is not altered, and that doesn't automatically happen from, let's say, a change in political or economic structures, then the problem of racism persists. And the practice of racism, that all kinds of discriminatory practices and privileges that are given to those who impose racial discrimination, all of those sort of things have to be addressed. So for Fanon, the fundamental problem of racism is that it depersonalizes the individual, okay? And I think the task that he had throughout his life was to oppose this depersonalization and restore the personalization of the individual. That is, restore the personal dignity and the capacity for fulfillment and for the expression of the fullness of one's human capacities, which racism suppresses. And so unless there's a transformation of human relations, not simply political economic structures on an interpersonal level, you're not going to get to a new society. Just parenthetically, just to end here, because I don't want to speak too long on any one point, on one question. But I mean, one thing that strikes me in terms of the expression of this new humanism, it's a very famous story when Fanon is working as a psychiatrist in Algeria during this horrible, violent war where the French killed at least 500,000 Algerians fighting for independence, gets a knock on his door, so to speak, one day, and who is there but a white paramilitary officer, somebody working for the French military, asked to be led into the clinic to be treated. Fanon interviews him, brings him into his office and says, okay, what are you doing here? What's up? And to make a long story short, this French officer basically says, well, I'm having a lot of problems. I can't sleep at night. I'm unable to have sexual relations with my wife. I don't know why. I'm having nightmares. I'm really falling apart. Maybe you can help. I heard you're a good psychiatrist. I'm looking for help. And so Fanon actually has a discussion of this in one of his works, of his discussion with this guy. And what he asks him is that, well, what are you doing with the French military? And he says, well, I torture people professionally. This is what he does 8 hours a day. So Fanon talks about the dehumanization of this individual's self-inflicted dehumanization, right, by working for the French military authorities. But he doesn't dismiss him and say, hey, get out of my office, right? So it's not on the grounds of liberal humanitarianism, right? Not that old-fashioned type of humanism. He wants to understand how racism affects the psychic structure of the oppressor as well as the oppressed, and treats the guy, okay, puts him under therapy. Now, it's not simply because that's professionally was obligated to do, but Fanon had a notion that it is possible to transform the dehumanized state of human personality, the corroded state of human personality that capitalism and racism and sexism and homophobia and all these other phenomena impose upon us. It is possible to change that. And if you can't change that, if you don't have that faith that it can be changed, then it becomes very problematic what kind of actual new society one's going to create as a result.
It's interesting that you bring that up because on some other shows, this conversation has been happening about is it possible to de-radicalize these hate mongers, if you will? And this is definitely anecdotal, but yesterday before I went on air, I live by the beach. So I went to go walk down to the beach and reread this thing I wrote that I was going to be interviewed about. And as I'm doing it, an older Asian man walked up to me and just started talking to me out of the blue, which happens in a beach town, right? People are just happy to be in front of the ocean. And as he's talking to me, he tells me that he's from Cambodia. So the first thing I say is, "Oh, did you leave during Pol Pot?" He goes, "Yeah, but I liked it there." I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah. I was in the Khmer Rouge as a child." He goes, "They treated us great. I didn't want to leave." And had a 20-30 minute conversation or so with this man that was what we would call a child soldier, but he definitely denounced the whole child soldier thing. He says, "Look, man, they gave us the M16s, but we couldn't shoot them. We were too small." He goes, "I was like 10."
Right.
But it was an interesting conversation, because as he comes to America, he tells me about encountering racism, because the first place he came that gave asylum to his people was Georgia in the 70s. I was like, oh wow. So it was an interesting take, but in that conversation about, can you de-radicalize people as you talk about the new society, there becomes this conversation of, do you punch a Nazi or do you try to de-radicalize a Nazi? Can you de-radicalize a Nazi? And I think it can happen, but it's definitely a long, laborious process. And, you know, it's kind of like getting people off drugs. You don't just walk up to somebody and say, "Do you need help?" And then they get it. You know, it is definitely a process.
And certainly that was not Fanon's approach, of course, and nor would I endorse it. When it comes to a Nazi, you defeat them. You don't treat them. A revolutionary, it's a contest of wills, and you're not going to convince somebody to change their mind of something if they are excluded, if they exclude themselves from rational discourse, which is what a racist does. Okay, so an enemy like that ultimately simply has to be either silenced or defeated in one way or another. And this is why Fanon was a firm advocate of revolutionary violence within the African context. He didn't make a universal of violence, as some people claim that he did, but he certainly didn't think he was going to win many of the French colons over to the cause of a liberated Algeria, although he left the door open for that. That's something that people should keep in mind. He didn't want the French settlers to leave Algeria at the end of liberation, right? He argued within the FLN, where there was a lot of debates about this, that stipulations and conditions should be made that would make it possible for them to stay. But he wasn't anxious to keep them there if they weren't going to accept the new reality that they have to surrender their white privileges, right? So now I wouldn't want to generalize from the story that I told to suggest that either Fanon or myself is thinking that you can negotiate with Nazis or racists. But there is a possibility among some, as we know, who are willing to enter into a rational discourse, right? And willing to rethink where they're coming from, that they could change. But Fanon's concern, of course, was not with that. His primary concern, rightly so, was lifting up the dignity of those discriminated by racial violence and oppression. And rightly so, because just like Marx was not, when Marx used the word humanism, he didn't mean humanitarianism. He didn't mean, all men are brothers. That's not a slogan that Marx and Engels endorsed. They, workers of the world, unite. The bourgeoisie is not your friend, and you're not going to try to win them over. But of course, even in the Communist Manifesto, Marx says, in a revolutionary situation, a section of the ruling class will come over to the side of the revolutionaries. And we've seen evidence of that throughout history. And in fact, Marx himself is an example of that. He comes from a very bourgeois background, and yet he joined the Barricades, so to speak. The point is that the humanism has to do with it. What makes the new humanism new is that it's a humanism from the point of view, or from the point of the perspective of the oppressed. It's not a humanism that's from the top down that says, hey, everybody, let's just pretend that we live in a better world than appears to be. On the contrary, it's a new humanism that's forged through a trail of tears, right? Through a process of what Hegel calls negativity, what Marx calls the class struggle. And for Fanon, it's a Manichaean struggle, right, against the forces of reaction. So in the United States today, we're not going to win over the Republican right. The Republican right has won itself over to Donald Trump. First time in American history, we've had a major political party in America that's won over basically to neo-fascism. And that's precisely because they turned away from reason. They turned away from any pursuit of the truth. Tens of millions of people don't care about that. What they simply care about is protecting whatever privileges they perceive themselves to have. Those sort of people, I mean, you're not going to win them over.
Thank you for that. that was actually a great explanation.
Professor Hudis, I want to actually pivot a little bit back to negritude, because in your explanation of Fanon's evolution on the question of negritude, one of the things I read from Fanon, I didn't initially get it from him, but one of the things I understand from him in his critique of negritude is something that I've written about, that I've actually find is a consistent element of early aspects of Black political thought that is premised on the concept. Even if you read early writings from the writers, the proponents of the Haitian Revolution, the concept of racial vindicationism, the need to vindicate Black identity, to prove its valor or validity to the quote unquote, white class or the master class or to the West, in order to basically have one's humanity respected by this kind of quote unquote oppressive class. My position has always been that one of the word in French is piège, or one of the holes, or one of the fault lines of much of Black thought, which is a logical position when you are reacting to such an oppressive, degraded state, is that the notion of racial vindicationism, or what I call the politics of redemption, becomes such an obsessive point of reference in terms of stating the first actual foundations of your position relative to the forces of oppression, is that you concede that the forces of oppression have the right to determine your humanity in the first place. And what I find interesting about Fanon is that though he may not have said that explicitly, his writings demonstrate that he was aware that this is what negritude had basically fallen into. And his rejection of all things French reminds me very much of the Haitian founding father Jean-Jacques Dessalines, in that it was a very Dessalinian thing. It's like, we have to reject these people completely. Because, as you know, I'm sure you've read Fanon's writing in French, is that French, contrary to what many people in the Anglo-American world realize, there's a certain kind of toxicity to French racism that is so absolutely vile. I think that as someone who comes from a former French colony can understand why the immediate reaction would say we have to reject these French people completely. So I'd like you, if you can really talk about Fanon's awakening to that politics of redemption or vindicationist posture that plagues so much of Black thought. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on his perceptions of that, or how he would or did kind of react to that in his writing politically.
Yeah, very interesting. I agree with you with the thrust of your comments here. See, the irony is that negritude emerges as a movement to combat the inferiority complex that one is subjected to in the colonial context, right? But I think his view is that negritude ultimately falls victim to the very inferiority complex that it's protesting. Insofar as what? If you emphasize this question of vindication, right? I wish to be vindicated in terms of my subjectivity. Okay. Of course, that has there's a positive motive in that. Behind that undoubtedly lurks the notion that I want to be acknowledged for who I am, not for how I've seen or for how I'm treated. Right. There's something fundamentally inhuman about the way I'm being seen and being treated, and I want that reversed. But you see, that can go in a lot of different directions. One direction could be by trying to become more white, okay? In other words, there's a lot of expressions of that. Trying to become more white doesn't literally mean whitening your skin. Trying to become more white can also take the expression of, wanting to simply get people to acknowledge you for your Blackness, without suggesting any sort of revolutionary transformation to make that occur, okay? You want to fit into the established norm of things, within the established framework of things, but at the same time be acknowledged for who you are. Well, this is inherently contradictory. You're not going to be acknowledged as a person in a capitalist society It just doesn't happen. And capital views people as things, not as, that's the whole purpose of what capital is about. You accumulate capital by treating the individual not as a personification of economic categories, not as actual person themselves. But there's another direction that this can go, this politics of vindication. And certainly you can fall into a black essentialism or a kind of black nationalism, right? Which says that, oh, because this is who I am as part of this racialized group, okay? I can find a home in that, okay? And find some kind of peace or resolution, an island of safety, of spirit in my self-expression of my, so to speak, blackness. There is also positive elements of that. We shouldn't rush too fast to criticize that, because that could have certain very revolutionary implications as well, potentially. But it also has other implications that are not so revolutionary, because it comes back to Fanon's notion of sociogenesis. That is, that race is a social construction. Now, that means it's an imaginary notion. It's a completely imaginary notion, but it has very real political, social, everyday consequences, right? So when you try to capture a space for blackness that's independent of taking apart the society that gives these false biological attributes to such terms as blackness and whiteness, you're still operating within its framework. I mean, this is why I get rather annoyed, frankly, when I hear people, you get into kind of, sometimes you get in these arguments at philosophy conferences, or sometimes it shows up in my classroom. A student once asked me, for instance, not long ago, was Plato white, right? Because he heard about, probably heard about Burnell's thesis about Black Athenia. Was Plato actually white, or was Plato black? And he was asking that, because he wanted to know, hey, if he's black, maybe I'll read him. I'm tired of reading all these white folks, right? Why do you have to keep reading Descartes and these kind of guys? And, I'm sympathetic with that view. But I say, well, wait a second, hold on. We're reading Fanon in this class at the same time. And so I'm saying, what's the logical conclusion of sociogenesis? The logical conclusion of sociogenesis is that Plato was not white, and that nobody at that time was white, nor was anybody black, okay? Those are just terms of color differentiation, epidermal differentiations of color, but there was no social structures built upon those differences, right? This is something that comes in with the transatlantic slave trade, in the 15th century, beginning of the 15th, but really the 16th century, this categorization that, skin color now denotes this particularity called race. There's not even a word race in any European language prior to the 1460s, from what I can tell. And the word race, la raza in Spanish, was originally used to refer to Jews, who were first identified as a separate race during the period of the Spanish Inquisition in the 15th century. So these are all socially constructed notions, but we're so used to it seeping into us and defining our thought that even when we say we're against biological racial thinking and racialized constructions, as you fall into it. And as I mentioned, Negritude fell into it, and Fanon saw that. So a lot of the politics of vindication that you're referring to, I think sometimes resonates with that sort of failure to be consistently following through on the ramifications of what I consider a real paradigm shift that Fanon introduces, the concept of sociogenesis. He takes that condition that concept very, very seriously. This is why he says the problem is not that white Europeans came and colonized the world. The problem is that white Europeans who were part of a capitalist economy came and colonized the world, and that process carried with it, endemic to it, the birth of racialized ways of seeing and treating other people. Those are two different things. So when we talk about whiteness, we also have to be careful how we use that term. Some people use it as if, oh, wow, there was a social construction of whiteness occurred, in the Middle Ages or something, or even in ancient Greece or something, which doesn't seem to make any sense if it's the case, which I think all the evidence suggests, that these very categories are born much more recently. And we just tend to read them back into history and back into all sorts of other areas of our lives without realizing the ramifications of accepting this paradigm shift that Fanon introduced in ways of thinking about race and racism.
Well, one of the things I definitely want to do is give credit to your book, if we didn't mention the title, Frantz Fanon, Philosopher of the Barricades, Revolutionary Lives. So people, please go out and get the book as well. We'll definitely promote the link. But one of the things that I also wanted to for you to touch on, because there's so much in terms of the comprehensive nature of Fanon's work, is that one of the things that I think he was very prescient in this regard, which many contemporary Pan-Africanist revolutionaries also wrote about as well, Kwame Nkrumah to discuss as well, is that his position on the neo-colonial bourgeoisie, on the statements he made basically about the fact that, you know, we have these, some would call them petite bourgeoisie because they really don't even own means of production. We have this professional managerial class of Black people, Black and brown, some Arab people who exist in these former colonies, who have the educational capacity and the Western skill sets to become leaders of our societies. And what Fanon realizes at this early point in the revolution and the development of these nation states is that there is going to be a strong propensity and possibility that these people will basically align with former colonial powers or other powers and not be true to the actual revolutionary motivations of our movement, and, you know, play a role in which they are agents of the colonizer. And as we can see in myriad examples throughout the Black diaspora, that's exactly what happens. I would also argue that's pretty much exactly what happens in the case of the Haitian Revolution as well, is that these movements are betrayed by an internal, some people would use comprador class or neo-colonial bourgeoisie, if you will, that reify the same mechanisms of oppression that were placed on them by the colonizer. In saying that and in recognizing that, how exactly does Fanon address maintaining the internal integrity of the revolution, while at the same time recognizing that this factor is almost unable to be avoided?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Right, so we have this phenomena in which a group of people, which you expect, who want to oppose and do oppose their degradation, the way they're degraded by conditions of colonial domination, whether it be in the United States or whether it be anywhere else in the world, in an actual colony or in what you might call a post-colonial situation in the United States. And they come from a certain social strata that they definitely want to free themselves from this sort of degradation of themselves because of the way society racializes and oppresses them, the basis of their racialization, but at the same time want to achieve this sort of self-expression or liberation, if you want to call it that, without questioning the fundamental context of the society they're living in. Now that can happen to anybody, regardless of what class you're from. But the kind of attitude permeates what you're basically describing as the petty bourgeoisie, right? Yes. And in a colonial context, this becomes especially dangerous because the colonial petty bourgeoisie gains real material privileges by expressing itself, let's say, within a racialized framework, at the same time as accepting the parameters of the given structures of neocolonialism. They get contracts, they get foreign aid, they get military aid. They are able to exploit their own masses in a way that enables them to become much wealthier than the workers or the peasants or others within the society. So it's almost an inevitable development that both sides of this is going to happen, that regardless of class origin, there's always going to be a section of people, just like there's a section of the working class that will fight capitalism, but only in the sense of, oh, give me a better wages and benefits within the structure of the system, and then I'll be okay, right? There's nothing inherent in fighting against the injustices of the wage labor system that brings you to say, well, no, we have to have the entire structure of capitalism be uprooted. Merely getting better wages and benefits, while I want that and I'm going to fight for it, is not where I'm going to settle the score, right? I'm not going to settle my fight there. Same thing happens, a kind of a parallel phenomenon in the struggle against race and racism. Now, Fanon was aware that this was an inevitable problem in the African context, and it has a particular ring in the African and also to a large degree the Caribbean context, of course, because you don't have the same historical development as in Europe. The petty bourgeoisie in Europe has a, even with all that you can say against it, in certain contexts has a productive role, okay? And there's even places in Marx's work where he says, no, the petty bourgeoisie at certain historical junctures could even possibly play a revolutionary role. But Fanon sees that it's a parasitic class in the colonial context. You don't have the economic structures that you have in Europe. You don't have the kind of productive resources. So, and you're talking about extractive economies, right? Where still after independence, you have this neo-colonial model, which still, of course, prevails. I mean, if you take a look at Latin America, even countries as prosperous as Chile, the amount of extraction of ore being taken out of their country, being sent to China, for instance, the value of that, it's astronomical, right? They're still primary producers to a large degree, being sucked dry by neocolonialism. Well, in that kind of a situation, this petty bourgeois strata that wants to find its way and make peace with the system at the same time as presenting a posture of, oh, I wish to be vindicated for my racial oppression and take pride in my racial identity, well, that becomes even counterproductive to their very existence. So how does Fanon get around that? How does Fanon say we get around that? Because it's bound to be there. It's an objective, it's something that exists objectively. Well, in the African context, he says, but precisely because the productive base is so weak, precisely because we're talking about extractive economies without a truly large productive base of the economy, the petty bourgeoisie doesn't have as much strength as it might have in certain European contexts. What does have strength is that the majority of the population is outside of all of this, right? The majority of the population at the time that he's writing, certainly, are peasants. So this is one of the reasons why Fanon singled out the peasantry as the primary revolutionary force in Africa. It's an exaggeration and a caricature to say he completely dismisses the working class. That's not true. And sometimes he may have gone too far with his positive evaluation of the peasantry. But in the main, he was correct, I think, because he recognized that if the revolution is going to go beyond the bourgeois democratic stage, which is what he wanted to happen upon independence, he wasn't fighting just for national independence. He was fighting for new humanism. And what does a new humanism mean? A new humanism means transforming the fundamental basis of existing society, right? Uprooting it, root and branch. Well, what force can you rely on to do that? Well, you certainly can't rely on this petty bourgeois strata we're talking about. You can't rely strictly on the working class in the societies where industrial working class might represent 3 or 4% of the population, if that. So what do you rely on? Well, he says, you've got to ground the revolution in the masses, by which he means the peasant masses. And this is what the approach that he was taking in The Wretched of the Earth. Now, retrospectively, many people, especially Marxists, get me very annoyed sometimes. I'm a Marxist humanist myself, but because for that reason, I'm very annoyed at a lot of Marxists. Create these kind of arguments that, oh, well, you can't get there with the peasantry. It's got to be through the working class, qua working class. But you cannot make a successful transformation of society, and Fanon understood this, without the revolutionaries having the support of the majority of the oppressed. And if the majority of the oppressed are peasants, right, you better have their support. And if you don't, you better ground yourselves in them and find a way to get their support.
Would you say that's a post-Marxist view, though, to be kind of always questioning the working class / peasantry?
No, because that's exactly what Marx does, which is a page of Marx's life that unfortunately is, which I've written quite a bit about, by the way, before my Fanon book and now after as well. Just touched upon my Fanon book. But unfortunately, most people skip over. At the end of his life, Marx gets this really interesting letter from an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old, Vera Sasulich, right? It's like the 1880, 1881. It's like the last 2 years before he dies. And she says, dear Marx, I've now become I was a populist, now I'm supporting the peasants, now I'm a Marxist, my leader is this guy Plekhanov, but I've been asking them questions and they haven't been able to give me an answer to the question to my satisfaction. They tell me that Russia has to go through, because Russia was still a developing society at the time. You can say Russia was, part of the global South in a way.
Tsarist Russia, right? Yeah.
Right, Tsarist Russia.
In society, yeah.
Yeah, so she says, they're all telling me, the Marxists here in Russia, that Russia's got to go through an extended period of capitalistic development because we have a tiny working class and 90% of the population is peasant. And only when you have full-fledged capitalism for many decades in which the peasantry is converted into proletarians, only then can you openly wage the fight for socialism and put socialism on the agenda. And she says, they tell me that this is your position, But I don't know. I read Capital. I'm not sure that's what you say. Is that what you really mean? And Marx writes back and he says, well, there's nothing in my book Capital that will answer that question one way or the other, because it's the historical discussion of the accumulation of capital in my great book is restricted to just saying what happened in West Europe. But I'm not claiming that the rest of the world is going to follow that process. So he says, as a matter of fact, though, for the last 10 years, I've been studying Russia and other countries. He learned Russian when he was in his 60s to try to figure out what was going on there. And he says, from what I can see, the peasants are the revolutionary force, because there's these peasant communal institutions in the countryside, the rural commune, that are kind of almost proto-communistic in the way the peasants organize their daily lives. And he says, well, this could be a basis of a Russian communism that could be built without having to go through the destructive decades of capitalistic industrialization, so long as a couple of conditions were met. That is, that these communes maintain themselves and they weren't destroyed by one or another factor. And if once the peasants made this kind of social revolution to get rid of the czarist regime and tried to build this more like indigenous Russian socialism based on the communal forms of the rural countryside, if they get support from the workers of the industrialized West, because they need technology and everything else, they could actually get to communism before the West Europeans. And this is called Marx, right? Mm-hmm. Now, is that a post-Marxist position? It is a post-Marxist position if you accept vulgar Marxism as Marxism. But the problem is that that's the problem. We have all been raised on vulgarized conceptions of Marxism, whether we're for it or against it. It's a vulgar Marxism, that 20th century Marxism. So, I mean, there are great 20th century Marxists, don't get me wrong. But the predominant tendency has been a very vulgarized, unilinear, stages type of Marxism, which, by no accident, has had a lot of trouble dealing with race. I mean, you have Marxist theories on all sorts of issues. You even have Marxist theories of culture and of art and of aesthetics and of political structures, etc. Where is the Marxist theory of racialization? Who's done it? That's a gap. And the gap is there because of a kind of approach that I think was more of a stereotype of what Marx was really trying to get at. Marx was a much more expansive thinker than a lot of people recognize. So I think in that sense, Fanon didn't know any of this. He didn't know these late writings of Marx. But he was doing, as far as I can see, he was doing in Africa, trying to think through the problem in Africa in the same kind of terms that Marx was. He wasn't thinking about some metaphysical theory that explains how all societies have to forever develop. This is not what Marx was doing either. He protests at the end of his life. A review of his book Capital appears in Russian, and the guy credits Marx with developing a universal theory that predicts how all societies will develop. And Marx says, I beg your pardon, you do me too much credit and too much discredit. I don't know enough to make such comments. And he spends the last years of his life trying to understand what we now call the global South, and he dies before he writes much of this up because he didn't know enough to come to a conclusion.
It's interesting that you're making this point because just last weekend we had Steve Paxton on, who wrote a book called Unlearning Marx. I don't know if you're familiar with his work.
I haven't read it, no. Uh-huh.
But his book kind of takes the stance that the Stalin project was doomed to fail if you are a follower of Marx.
Absolutely.
And kind of set up the Soviet Union for what ended up happening with its fall with capitalists, setting it up to be capitalist more than it did having communism in one country. And me personally, I don't think that that's a good ideology, communism in one country, especially when the dominating power is a capitalist power. You're going to run into some issues.
Well, C.L.R. James, who was, of course, an important American, Trinidadian, American, British Marxist, and African, because he was everywhere. But C.L.R. James actually wrote an essay in 1940 or 41, I think it is, entitled "Soviet Russia is a Fascist State." He was with Dostoevsky. My mentor was the person who developed the Marxist theory of state capitalism in the Marxist movement in the early 1940s, mid-1940s, of Johnson Forrest's tendency. But he even went further than state capitalism. I'm not sure he continued with that line of argument. But he actually went so far as to say this has nothing to do with Marxism, right? I mean, slave labor camps and centralizing the economy in the hands of a small committee of individuals, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that Soviet communism, and I argue Chinese communism too, because Mao's model was based very much with some small changes on the Soviet model. This was a bigger gift to capitalism than could have dreamed. because of course they want to. Any capitalist wants to say we all, of course, they're not going to make a distinction of an anarchist, a Marxist humanist, a feminist, or a revolutionary feminist, a communist, a Stalinist, or whoever. If you're going to take away their property, which I think their property should be taken away if they accumulate too much of it. If you're going to take away your property on any basis, even if it's Bernie Sanders trying to take it away, you're a communist, or even if it's Barack Obama, which is ridiculous, you're a socialist. So they're going to attack us all on the same level. But the fact of the matter is they were able to say, well, look where they took away our property in the Soviet Union and here and everywhere else, and look how they ended up. Well, it becomes a strong propaganda tool to convince people not to go outside the boundaries of actually existing capitalism and to work within it, including when it comes to challenging its racialized structures. So this is a big, big problem. Why we need to start a new leaf and say, no, that post-Marx Marxism is not the same as Marx. Not to say that Marx has all the answers or that he was right in everything, or that we have to genuflect before his legacy, because that doesn't get us anywhere. But there are conceptions within the works of individuals like Marx, like Rosa Luxemburg, who, of course, they do a lot of work in, and Fanon. And I think there's a lot of similarities between Luxemburg and Fanon, as well as big differences. And many other thinkers that we can talk about. Cabral, for instance, which is one of my favorite thinkers.
How do you feel about Walter Rodney?
Mixed.
Interesting.
I actually briefly met him when I was very, very young. So I kind of adore that experience. And he was certainly a brave and a dedicated revolutionary. And a lot of the work that he was doing was really outstanding. But he operated within the standard Marxist-Leninist model. Gotcha. There's actually, Robin Kelly has an essay on Walter Rodney and Rosa Luxemburg in this book that just came out, which I also have a chapter in, Creolizing Rosa Luxemburg, which Paget Henry's also has a chapter in it, who's an important Caribbean theoretician, and draws out some of the contradictory problems in Rodney's own criticism, for instance, of Maurice Bishop in the New Jewel movement in Grenada, where I think that he was really more starting with the more hardline Marxist-Leninist elements of Austin and Cord, rather than Bishop himself, and I think that was highly problematic. I don't know if I agree with all of Robin's criticisms of Rodney for he kind of echoes C.L.R. James's position that the conditions of his murder were inadvertently, in part, brought on by his own political positions that he was taking in Guyana. That's an issue I haven't made up my mind about. But there are problems with he was part of that generation which didn't question much of the prevailing assumptions of 20th century Marxism, and I think that held him back.
Well, I'm sorry, Pascal, do you have a question? I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I am actually an admirer of Walter Rodney, and there are some of the points here. I mean, I see your overall point in terms of the problematic nature of what the Soviet project overall, but I still think that in the realpolitik of what they were dealing with as a nation, it was still a revolutionary project that had its faults and basically did aid in much of the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle that happened in the global South, particularly with the Cuban Revolution, as well as with the actions that were done in Africa as well, which of course were after Marx, and I would agree with that. But I think that criticism of the Soviet project is fair, and I think it's just justified. But I think it's very easy in the 11th hour to do real view mirroring and say, well, we would have been better off if we didn't have that. Because I would say that, the world post-Soviet in terms of what has happened in a unilateral kind of American empire, going from the war on terror to quite a variety of things without having the Soviet Union being able to check that power. I wonder, how much those who, feel good that the Soviet Union is gone feel about those developments as well, particularly with the rise of, as you were saying, neo-fascism that we have in the wake of this kind of Western unipolarity also. So, I think that we would have our disagreements in terms of that particular analysis of the utility of, the rise of the Soviet Union as well as Mao and Chinese communism, which, again, this is something that is a common internal disagreement, debate amongst Marxists, leftists of all strains, and I get that. But I'm more interested in staying on Fanon, And
Yes.
what I find valuable with Fanon is that he represents the best of all of these traditions, in that he has the revolutionary anti-capitalist sentiment of the Marxist-Leninist camp, without having the economist determinism of the more vulgarist aspect of Marxism, and at the same time understanding the need for having a sophisticated understanding of the way race within these structures needs to be analyzed and dissected as well. So I think that his ability to fuse all of those traditions at a time in which we're seeing the newly liberated former colonial countries come about demonstrates his brilliance. But I want to ask a question that, as a matter of fact, I was talking to one of our friends of the show about. This might seem kind of reductionist, but I like your thoughts. Would you consider Fanon a postmodernist thinker or post-structuralist?
No, which is not to say that there are elements of Fanon that have influenced postmodernism and post-structuralist thought to some degree, among some of them at least. But postmodernism, post-structuralism, beginning with the Ends of Man speech of Derrida in '68, which was delivered in May '68, just about a week after the revolution in Paris failed, curiously, as a historical moment, right through to whatever you want to call postmodern or post-structuralism for the decades afterwards, and certainly in Foucault, there is a conscious, deliberate attempt to put humanism into the dustbin of history. So there's a wholesale a criticism of humanism as being no different than the kind of abstract or even reactionary so-called humanism that characterized the Enlightenment or the Renaissance. Now, we can talk a lot about why that's problematic, right? First of all, there's many different Enlightenments, right? There's no one thing called the Enlightenment. Spinoza is not the same as John Locke. De Condorcet, who organized the group to Society of the Friends of the Blacks and fought for the abolition of slavery in France, is not the same as Isaac Newton, who, of course, was a firm defender of slavery, or Thomas Jefferson, or we can talk about a lot of other people. Without getting into those kinds of weeds about, the European intellectual history, post-structural and postmodernism were utilized, to the extent that Fanon was utilized by such thinkers, they were making him compatible with a certain discourse in academia. So it's kind of like you cut off the humanist dimension of Fanon and you emphasize his critique of the failures or the impending failures of the African revolutions. Now, Fanon was prophetic in seeing that the independence, the movements for independence, though a great moment was reached with independence, was nevertheless only a cause for a few days of celebration, as it were, because there's so many limitations and contradictions that they now had to deal with, that if they didn't deal with them effectively, there would be a retrogression. And postmodernism is basically a school of thought that's emerging from those who have experienced profound disappointment with political transformation, starting in May '68 and continuing afterwards, and who basically didn't believe that fundamental social transformation on any kind of systemic level is any longer possible. Now Fanon is coming from a very different direction. He believes it is possible. And I think that if you remove the humanist dimension from Fanon, or simply leave it to the side, as it's sometimes done, you lose the beauty of what you not only lose the depth of his negative critique, that is what's going wrong with the African revolutions, but most importantly, you cut out, you're left without any sense of where to go from there, where to go from the negative. And I also have to say that if you look at the history of post-structuralist thought, you go back to Althusser, who was, of course, Foucault's teacher, right? And was from Algeria, right? Well, Derrida was too. By the way, Derrida has some good things. I'm not dismissing Derrida as a thinker. I respect Derrida a great deal, and there's some aspects of Derrida that, especially some of his later work, which are quite on point. But nevertheless, the point is you look at Althusser, you look at Foucault. I mean, he was part of the French Communist Party from 1950 to 53. Then he left it, but he didn't leave it over its policy on the African revolutions or the colonies. Where did he voice any strong support for the Algerian Revolution or for the African revolutions, for that matter? If he did, I'm not aware of it. And I don't think that's a minor issue. This is the question of the struggle against colonialism and racism is the issue of the 20th century and the 21st. Okay, that is the there's, and one of the reasons why I think Fanon didn't kind of declare himself a Marxist or see himself within that context explicitly is he didn't want to get bogged down to the weeds of the debates within different Marxist tendencies, because that was going to take him away from his mission. His mission was to do something that had not been done before, which was to provide a philosophical account of race and racism, which, as you mentioned, is both systemic, that is, grasping its roots in the nature of capitalism and what the social system we've been living under for 400 years, but also has deep psychological roots that outlive the origins of those racial determinations and simply are not automatically brought down by a struggle against capitalism. And he's right about that. It's not automatically brought down by a struggle against capitalism. So he was trying to do something very new, and I think he had to step out of that a bit. He had to step out of that a lot and say, listen, I'm going to work on this angle and on this particular problem that I'm experiencing, my lived experience. I noticed that earlier in the chat, somebody had asked the question, what about phenomenology? Which would be an interesting discussion to have. Fanon was very interested from an early age, influenced by, as Louis Gordon has pointed out in several of his books, in phenomenology. He studied under Merleau-Ponty in Lyon, who was one of the foremost French phenomenologists. One of the central points in phenomenology is what? Bracketing. If you cannot come to a definitive answer on something, bracket it out and then focus on the fundamental issue that you do have evidence for resolving. Fanon was going in that direction. And I don't think that that means we bracket out the debates in Marxism today for ourselves, but there's a reason he took the approach that he did. So no, I don't think that he would have been happy with postmodernism or post-structuralism. I think that he would have looked, I mean, if you read Homi Bhabha's introduction to Black Skin, White Mask, I cannot believe that Fanon would not be furious at that.
So,
and
I shot fired.
I did have a question as far as like bringing things into today, as far as what we can learn and take forward. And you mentioned like Luxemburg, and I kind of like been thinking quite a lot of like how to, like at least the inherent contradictions where you could have a movement or you can have a certain action that could be on the step to revolution or the overturning of capitalism, but then also too it could just be an action unto itself that's just something that is done. So I wonder if there's anything with Fanon's critique of Negritude, and possibly falling into this falling into the structure of what of itself was fighting against. How do I guess how can we go moving forward, trying to learn the lessons of Fanon as far as deciding what actions, what movements are revolutionary, or even like going back to the some of the writings of Marx later on of like this can be revolutionary if X, Y, and Z then happens.
Mm-hmm. Great question. Yeah, I mean, what comes to my mind when you speak of this is he has this very interesting passage in the Wretched of the Earth. It might be repeated more than once because he didn't write that much about the United States, right? So and he wasn't trying again to do a universal political theory that would apply to all situations. This is not the phenomenological approach. Is to focus on erlebnis, right? The lived experience of the subject, of the individual, and develop your theory from that 0 point of your orientation. That is your particular standpoint upon existence in the world, rather than trying to make these broad claims for which you lack substantial evidence. But he has this very interesting point where I think does relate, and I think he is thinking about the United States, where he says in the colonial situation, there is no buffer. It's a Manichaean world, right? There's no buffer between the colonized and the colonizer, right? It's very naked and brutal and direct, the exploitation. And every institution of the state operates on behalf of the colonizer, and every life situation of the colonized is impacted by these visible and invisible forms of domination that confront the individual on a daily level. But he says in other contexts, he says, doesn't mention the word the United States, but I think he's thinking about it, is there are there are these intermediary layers, right? You have the police, and you have civil society, right? You have these institutions of civil society that can mediate conflicts to some degree between the oppressor class and the oppressed. But what have we been seeing in America in the last 30, 40 years? I mean, or further than that, going all the way back to what the Panthers pointed out back in the late 60s, right? When Huey Newton talked about the deindustrialization of America and what does that mean for the future of capitalism, he was addressing that in 1969, right? Because after all, who first experienced deindustrialization in the United States was primarily African Americans before the word even existed, okay? And that is that what we're seeing is that the lines of oppression and the oppressive structures have become much clearer. And we're moving in a much more Manichaean direction here in this so-called bourgeois democracy, which always tries to pretend that there's buffers between these different classes. And so I think my reading of Fanon would suggest that kind of political activity that is most effective are those that actually challenge this increased kind of forms of domination, like the police. And the fact that we had the biggest protest in American history in 2020, of course, against police abuse, 26 million people. There was never that many people for that long a period of time out in the streets of the United States in continuous protest that I'm aware of. Tells us something about where to go. And it also shows us the challenges that were brought up by several of you in your questions and comments from earlier. Because when I'm part of the Chicago campaign to defund police, and we've been, doing a lot of work for the last year on this. And it's a hard slog, right? Because there you run into what you had called the national petty bourgeoisie, the national democratic petty bourgeoisie within the Black community, which does not want to go along with defunding, which exposes a lot of the rifts within the movement over these issues, and within, not movement, but within certainly those who claim to be concerned or opposed to the problem to racism. And I think that those are some really, really important struggles, because to call for the abolition of the criminal justice system, to call for the abolition of police and prisons, you cannot have racialized capitalism with these institutions in existence, without not being in existence. Racialized capitalism cannot perpetrate itself without them.
I wanted to ask you about the concept of racialized capitalism or racial capitalism, which is a term that we actually hear here and there, mostly from the, and I'm not saying this as a pejorative, as from the academics that come on the show. Right. They say the term racial capitalism, but I'm noticing that this term is actually starting to infiltrate the lexicon of kind of everyday speak that you do here on the left, especially the online left. And Pascal, please feel free to add on to this, because I know you have your opinion on racial capitalism as you got into a conversation, a mildly heated conversation over the concept of racial capitalism with a guest when we first started together. Do you remember that?
There's been so many, man.
Well, part of a mass movement.
When I hear the term racial capitalism or racialized capitalism, ultimately, isn't it just capitalism? And when you say racialized capitalism, what does it do to the fight against capitalism when we start now making it racialized? Are we going to genderize it next?
Is it already? Is that already there to an extent?
Pascal can say this much better than I can.
I have a very simple position on the concept of racialized capitalism and why I find it problematic. I think that one of the actual assumptions when you say racialized capitalism is that the only reason you don't like capitalism is because it doesn't work for Black people. And if it did, we'd have no problem with it.
Mm-hmm. That's a possibility. Yeah, that is a problem. I agree. It's a useful term if it's used in a useful way or in a helpful way. But like a lot of terms we can talk about in politics, it's a very slippery term that's subject to all kinds of interpretation. The term actually came out of the South African liberation struggle. I believe it was first coined by Neville Alexander, right? Who was a Trotskyist revolutionary in South Africa, who had to deal with the specificity of the situation there, in which capital accumulation and racism were inextricably connected, right? So the debate within the South Africa movement was, is this a fight? Is the fight against apartheid and the fight against racial discrimination going to quasi-automatically challenge the structures of capitalism, or are they separable, right? And that's the debate that he was in between the ANC and the Black Consciousness movement, right, over that very question. Cedric Robinson, of course, is more famous for the use of that phrase. But when you reread that book, you realize it's slippery in his own use of it as well. Because on the one hand, he wants to say that capitalism, at least in certain historical contexts, has been, from its inception, thoroughly racist, which he's certainly right about. Class relations in American history have always been mediated by racial determinations. And if you don't face up to that, and you call for, because if you're not overburdened by that fact, you pass over the fact that struggles against racism, that independent struggles of Black masses against racial discrimination, have time and time again proved the catalyst for the class struggle and the vanguard of promoting class struggle rather than a diversion from it, right? But the other side of Cedric Robinson is that then when he goes to explain what he means by this, he starts talking about the origins of racialized capitalism and feudalism, that presumably anti-Black racism can be found in the attitude of, I guess, the English colonizing the Irish in the 12th century, etc., or the Vikings attacking the French, etc., which I don't think he supplies any historical, a coherent historical analysis of that. But furthermore, it raises the question, look, if it's not the transit, if you're going to say that race is socially constructed, the question that comes to mind immediately is what specific social relations are responsible for this construction of racism? Now, I think there's a good Marxist answer to that. You don't have to be a Marxist to agree with it, but I think it comes from Marxism, and that is the transatlantic slave trade, the birth of the world market, and is the rosy dawn of capitalist accumulation based on the labor of Black skins, right? That is what made the Industrial Revolution possible and what made modern capitalism possible and still makes it possible. But if you're going to push it back and say, no, this exists in white societies, even going way back before the transatlantic slave trade, then you're obligated to say, what are the specific social relations that give rise to whiteness and anti-Black ways of seeing? If you can't answer that question, Robinson doesn't, then you're falling back, as far as I can tell, into a biological view of race, as if it's something that just naturally occurs. And you're leaving capitalism, not only capitalism off the hook, you're missing Fanon's paradigmic shift about race as a social construction. So the reason why I think where racial capitalism comes in importance, when I hear the word racial capitalism, what I think of the specificity, especially of American historical development, where class relations are thoroughly saturated and mediated by considerations of race from the very beginning. So you can't undo the class structure of capitalist modernity without having racism and the battle against racism take the priority.
Right. Wouldn't those who would consider themselves Marxists, and I have not met one who would deny this, is that the way in which capitalism functions in America, it requires that Black people disproportionately be relegated to the reserve army of labor. We had Richard Wolff on a show, and he basically admitted that, that's absolute. Not only did he admit that, he went even further than that axiom, basically saying that Black people are the shock absorbers of capitalism in the United States.
But we can also say that about immigrants.
Yes, as we did mention the role of immigrants in that as well. So the issue I have with the term racial capitalism is that, it seems kind of like, oxymoron. It's self-evident to the fact that the nature of the way in which capitalism works is that it particularly has a racial hierarchy to it, going back to the way in which in the ages of primitive accumulation, going back to the genocide of the Native Americans, taking of their land, the transatlantic slave trade. So it makes me ask the question, if we know this and we realize that this is what capitalism requires to function, turning racial capitalism into the term of art, again, understanding how this basically works in this contemporary era in which race is being served to meet a bourgeois liberal notion of democratizing equality of opportunity, distribution, and recognition, under a neoliberal frame that does not actually change allocation of wealth or resources, that saying racial capitalism basically is a means of saying capitalism don't work for black folk in a time where capitalism is working less and less for almost everyone.
Right. But so I certainly agree with everything that you said. But the qualifier here is that there's also dimensions of racism that cannot be reduced directly to the laws of capitalist economics. So if you think about, for instance, the prison industrial complex, and of course you can make a very good argument, and I would agree with it to a large degree, that this is driven by purely economic motives. But then the question is, why is there such a high disproportion of those who are negatively affected by this prison industrial complex who are African Americans? Well, I think that goes to an extra economic factor. This criminal justice system that we have, the prison industrial complex, emerges in response to 1968, emerges in response to the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, and the radicalization of a whole generation of Black youth. And the bourgeois society decided this is a way to get these kids off the street, is to put them in the prison, right? And this is continuous since then. Now, is that direct? Does that have no economic motives or consequences? I'm sure that it does in some respects, but in some of the other respects, it doesn't. When it costs $60,000 a year to keep somebody in a state penitentiary, which is more money now, or maybe it's a little less than what it takes to get pay somebody tuition at Harvard University or something, it doesn't look like it makes a lot of sense from the strict economic imperatives of the system.
I actually want to respond to that because I'm glad you mentioned that, because I actually brought up a piece that actually addresses it specifically. It's called The Economic Origins of Mass Incarceration. And it actually deals with the perception of the argument that the only thing that motivated mass incarceration was the rebellions of the 60s, without taking into context that, as with every period of rebellion, there is a high increase of crime, particularly violent crime. And what actually is done in this piece, the economic origins of mass incarceration, which you can find in Catalyst, is it demonstrates that particularly the way in which mass incarceration is transpired in the United States, which is also something you can read in Louis Kant's book, Punishing the Poor, is that the motivation for mass incarceration by far is more driven by political economy than by race, because of the fact that at this period of increase in crime, you also have massive deindustrialization again as well. So what becomes the racial reality of mass incarceration is, again, as a result of the fact that Black people disproportionately, because of the way they are used in American political economy, are the reserve army of labor, and they suffer more adversely from the social effects, causing an increase in proliferation and crime and poverty. And at the same time, and one of the great pieces of evidence that the article demonstrates is that the actual racial disparity in the rate of mass incarceration from the 40s up until the 21st century stays relatively flat, while the actual rate of mass incarceration for people who are college educated or above and high school dropouts expands precipitously. So the argument he's making is that if race is the motivation for mass incarceration, why is it that college educated Blacks drop precipitously as the rate of those who are incarcerated when Blacks who are high school dropouts are going up? So what he's saying is that what we're actually seeing is that the problem is that poverty, which disproportionately affects Black people, is what is actually driving this than simply Blackness.
Well, can't we also add that as Black people are starting to get certain advances with the civil rights movement, at the same time we're starting to see factories leave? So as we're finally getting into unions, these jobs are leaving. And also I would want to add, as someone that has traveled extensively through the middle of the country, as a Bay Area native, it is very shocking for me in my travels to see how the Rust Belt areas, which are a lot wider outside of places like Cleveland, and where Marcus knows Columbus, like the small chocolate parts of Ohio, stuff like that, but predominantly white areas that are suffering the same effects. And if we say the shock absorbers of capitalism, you can always add those people who are disproportionately affected by the factory closings that are still happening now. I have to remember, was it 2 years ago or a year ago, 4 or 5,000 people had lost work recently when a bunch of factories closed after they were supposed to stay open. And if you look at prison populations, there is a growing white population, especially with the growing opioid addiction, which is causing people to go back to heroin. You know, I've spent probably too much time in West Virginia and in the Appalachians in general. And that's what blew me away about it, because it was a hillbilly version, if you will, of what I grew up with in Richmond, California. Which is why I could navigate those areas, I guess, so well, because it's all the same thing. It's just a different color on it. But you know, if you're in Chicago, much like me being in Oakland, California, Pascal being from New York, and Marcus now, you know, in DC, we definitely see the racialized view of mass incarceration, because this is also where a bunch of us live. Highly concentrated in these major metropolitan areas, because for years, you know, for me, that's why my family settled in California. It's where the work was during the New Deal.
Mark,
well, you know, I spent a little bit of time, not a ton of it, so I'm not claiming to have any particularly important insights here. But Harlan County, Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky, which is very close to West Virginia, which is
I know exactly where you're talking about.
You know what goes on there.
Johnson City, Tennessee. I love, yeah.
I was staying in a little hamlet called Hell for Certain, and I realized after a day or two why they called it that. Okay, so and you know, this is going back about 15 years ago, and like there was a long history of not just labor struggle, but I mean, people forget about the proportion of black miners in those areas in Appalachia, right? And the solidarity between white and black labor, you know, in those struggles, which often took a very violent form. Robert Olbitz has a book out, by the way, that discusses this in terms of further back history, when workers shot back, I think it's called. But anyway, the point is that you had a lot of native, indigenous American radicalism in them hills, okay? And I was there with a friend who was black, and we were giving a talk to a group of, we were having discussions on radical ideas. We got a great reception. I remember he was one of the folks from the hills, I'm not going to use the word hillbilly, said to him as he's leaving, he said, "Oh, you got to come back here more often. We got to have you back more often. I mean, boy, this is great. The kind of stuff you've been talking about." He wasn't talking about me. He was talking about my friend. Anyway, the point is, now, right? I mean, it is like Trump territory. How did that happen? And that's the thing that we have to think about, right? How does that happen? It's not a question simply of who is being affected in what respect by this, by the deindustrialization that we document and talk about, but why the response? Why is it that you have white workers who are subject to deindustrialization and rightly complaining about it, then using that as a basis? And certainly not saying that's true of all white workers, because there's a myth that most white workers support Trump, but a larger percentage than ever we've seen voting Republican. So that's a serious problem. Why are they buying into the racist agenda? And they have to know it's a racist agenda. When African Americans were subjected to those conditions of deindustrialization and certainly did not move in a right-wing direction like that. So what's
the same reason working class black people are increasing their support of Trump? Because they are.
No, Trump. First of all, let's just be honest. Let's be honest for a second. This is just my opinion, Dr. Hudis. Why? Because of those shock absorbers, and the shock absorbers now look a little different. We're talking about immigrants, especially through the 80s, when we have a huge flow from South and Central America, especially Central America, because of the dirty wars, right? And if you look at places like the South and just look at meat packing, and I don't know if you guys remember, about a year or so ago, there was a raid on a meat packing plant from immigration, from ICE. And these meatpacking plants historically were black. Black people worked there. They actually were union jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Let's remember in 86, Reagan signs that bill that gives 3 million, I wouldn't say it's all Mexican Americans, but 3 million Latin Americans citizenship. That wasn't a gesture of goodwill. That was a way to try to start to fuck with the labor market.
Mm-hmm.
That was his whole goal. That was part of that huge project. And when you looked at the people that were being deported, they weren't making more than the black people were some 20 years prior. And I think that's where Trumpism comes in, because the rhetoric around immigration is never rhetoric around labor struggles. It's always about the benevolence of America being this wonderful place, giving opportunity to the downtrodden of some backwards land. And it's never about labor struggles. So it's easy for the Donald Trumps of the world to come in, the Steve Bannons of the world to come in and really frighten people. And even the ADOS movement, for the most part, echoes the same rhetoric of white nationalism. Africans will not replace us.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is just my opinion.
Well, some going on to specific, like as far as like the white people in the South, something that I find interesting, and as you're talking about, over time, it just even seems like their cultural aspects, especially in relation to the state, was like completely gone. And like I think of like NASCAR or something that like no longer makes sense to me, as an origin of something that's like literally running from the cops, doing illegal activity. But then, like if you look at a NASCAR event today, and you'll see probably more Blue Lives Matter flags, than anything else. Where, yeah, that's something where it's like, does racism, I guess, does those cultural pulls, end up really being such a force that you kind of erase even recent history, like just the advent of the like automobile, and especially to the point where people can now like construct their own versions to run from the police, to be a type of resistance of the state, and then within a generation, you've got a completely kind of like overturn of that whole aspect. I don't know. It's just something.
I mean, if we already acknowledge, and I think we all agree here about the reserve army of labor capacity of blacks and immigrants serving that shock absorber role, I don't think it becomes a mystery as to the capacity of the ruling class to weaponize white anxiety about displacement or lack of preference in terms of policy consideration into a type of voting pattern that becomes reactionary. This was done by Nixon, starting with the hard hat riots, hard hat rebellions in the 70s. What was the Reagan Democrat? The Reagan Democrat was basically a white working class person who was a loyal Democrat voter before 68, and because of the belief that the Negroes have gotten too much, started to basically move to the Republican Party. So none of this denies the fact that within the working class, white or otherwise, there is a clear potential for racist reactionary politics to be tapped into, to be weaponized, to become a basis of support. There's no question about that. That also does not deny that there is a materials level to what motivates that racial angst. And what motivates that racial angst is that you giving those brown folk what I thought I was supposed to get, because yes, there is a racialized component to capitalism. There's no question about that whatsoever. I don't necessarily think that those things are divergent in terms of their reality at all. They're just easily manipulated in the consciousness in a society that has always rendered blackness or foreignness or Latino-ness into the dustbin of economic functionality, giving those people the belief that they have the natural born right to believe that they should get theirs first. That is the nature of American capitalism, which is clearly racialized. I just think it's kind of redundant to admit the obvious. But I also think that when you say that, you're basically saying to people who are not white, who are not black, who are suffering from capitalism, or who may be other ethnic groups, that, well, the problem is racial capitalism. It's okay, that means that capitalism doesn't work for black people. We don't have to worry about that then. You know, right. If you say the problem is racial capitalism, then how do you get people who are not racialized to challenge capitalism?
Well, but we also have the problem, right, of there's a tradition in the American left, which has not gone away by any means, of wanting to challenge capitalism and treat racial issues as a secondary consideration.
Well, I'm not making that. I think it's.
I know you're not making that argument. I'm just saying that's one possible virtue of the phrase racialized capitalism. It's a pushback against that. But you're right. Like any phrase, it's full of ambiguity, which is why I try to suggest even the author, the person most famous for the phrase, Cedric Robinson, his work is full of ambiguities in this. And actually, it leads him out of Marxism, right? I mean, he the second edition of Black Marxism, he says, I'm with Foucault, I'm no longer with Marx.
The main reason why I posit the position that I have is that as someone who is a student of how black politics in the contemporary moment works, and understanding that we have what you refer to as this kind of petty bourgeoisie, or what we refer to as the black political class, that basically functions in a kind of similar way to the comprador or neo-colonial bourgeoisie, if you will, that they have rendered black politics to be to the service of the liberal bourgeoisie capitalist ruling class, to the detriment of the majority of the masses of black people. One of the consequences of that political reality, which is largely a post-civil rights 50-year plus counter-revolution phenomenon, which is a framing that we use on this show to talk about the 50 years of politics since the assassination of King, is that there is an intentional attempt to use race and racism purely in one of the ways that Fanon talks about it, as an interpersonal problem, because it's easier for black elites to use the interpersonal narrative, because what it does, it makes it easier to demand policy that benefits them, because it makes no material demands on the structures of capital. As a result, the posture of what becomes black politics in this contemporary moment is an attempt to double down on the racialization of harm, not because they actually want to address the concerns and needs of the majority of black people, but to serve the interests of capital by deflecting black people away from demanding materialist politics and policies that would disproportionately benefit the majority of poor and working class black people who are rendered to the reserve army of labor, like a federal jobs guarantee, like a universal employment basis, which some of these race reductionists will say class politics, class-based policy don't work for black people. Really? Does your grandmother doesn't like his Social Security and Medicare? Your uncle doesn't like his VA benefit? You want to get rid of those for him too?
I like my VA benefit. But going on the other side,
so the reason why I'm particularly animated in addressing the contemporary hyper racialization of capitalism in a way divorced from political economy is because it's a transparent ploy of the political chattering class, the black political elites right now, to keep black people tied into these non-materialist policies that end up benefiting that black elite and doing nothing for the majority of black people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, going on the other side of that, addressing the super chat, what does the working class material gain from Trumpism or Brexit, which both advocate for less labor protections, / benefits, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, that's the point. They don't gain materially at all. And it's not an accident that the parts of the country where whites obtain some of the highest percentage of social benefits are precisely the areas where they're voting most strongly for Trump. So that's a good question, though, which I'm not sure I have the answer to. Is it what how Du Bois tried to answer the question, and they wrote
wages of whiteness.
Right, psychological wage instead of an economic wage. I'm not convinced by that argument, frankly, but I'm open to it. But I'm not convinced by it. I mean, we're getting into something that racism is so fundamentally irrational. It becomes very difficult at a certain point to explain the motivations. I'll just give you, one example, an anecdote is somebody who I know is doing research at a Chicago area university for his PhD on the radical right. So he embeds himself in radical right organizations. This is before Trump. His research starts before Trump, back to the Tea Party. And he is in Colorado, and they say, well, this is guy who was very active in the Tea Party movement in Colorado, who used to be a uranium miner. Now he's at home because he's on a breathing device because he has all kinds of lung problems, emphysema or whatever else from his work environment. And he interviews him and tries to get him to explain to him why is he such a Tea Party proponent? Why does he hate Obama so much and everything else? And asks him and says to him, well, but you do realize that, like, you're so against Obamacare. You said that's what set you off. Look at you. You're breathing through this tube, right? And you can't afford your own medical insurance. You admitted that to me at the beginning of this interview. You would benefit by these scenarios, right? These policies. Why don't you come out for them? Why you oppose them? And he pulls the mask off of his face, right? He can barely breathe. And he stuns out, and just blurts out with whatever little breath and energy he has. I'd rather die here on the spot than have one nickel of my money go to these blacks and immigrants. How do you explain that one? It's a good question. Is that a psychological wage that he's gaining? He's certainly not gaining an economic wage. Or is it something that is like what Du Bois himself experienced when he witnessed, a lynching, the aftermath of a lynching in the South, when he went back down south, and talks about that in some of his correspondence, and where he questions his own theory of the psychological wage because of that. Or is there something deeper involved? Fanon, by taking there is always a danger of approaching a psychoanalytical approach to problems of racism that, of course, disassociates itself from political economy and disassociates it from politics in general. That's always a risk, just like it's a risk that politics and political economy will disassociate itself from examining and dealing with the psychic impact of racial discrimination. That's why from the very first line of Black Skin, White Mask, first pages, I think it's first page or page 2, Fanon makes that point that the two have to be dealt with in tandem, right? That's, in a nutshell, that to me is what makes Fanon an outstanding figure. He is able to deal with the both sides of this issue as one, in tandem with each other. But it's very hard to keep these things together. So you have the identity politics that disassociates them from one side. You have class reductionism that disassociates them from another side. And it's very easy to get pulled in one or another direction. And that's why I would have to say that just to pull out some phrases from Black Skin, White Masks, for instance, some people, like in post-colonial studies, do this all the time, that I've had to deal with, and downgrade or disregard the wretched of the earth, which is Fanon's manifesto for actual revolution, okay, is a very damaging type of thing. You got to take, if a thinker has something valid to say, you got to ask, is there an internal coherence to their thought? And if I don't grasp and convey that internal coherence, what damage am I doing to that thinker? And I think Fanon has this remarkable internal coherence to all of what he was doing that is precious to understand, hold on to, and replicate ourselves, because that's a way to navigate ourselves past these kind of false dualities that a lot of you are very correctly pointing to.
Well, if we're coming close to the end of our show, but we didn't ask a question we wanted you to go into. I don't know if you can cover it in the time before our 2 o'clock hour. The way in which Fanon has been used to rationalize Afro-pessimism. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on that school of thought overall? Do you think it's a misreading of Fanon? Can you give us a brief statement on your thoughts regarding that?
Yeah, I just want to do a shout out here to Toussaint, because a number of years ago he asked me this question, which impelled me to look at Afro-pessimism a bit more closely. He's with us here today, I see. But the point is, there's a lot that could be said. I think that the notion of exceptionalism, that an exceptional condition, and to try to explain the predicament of your people as being an exceptional predicament, is in itself problematic and doesn't get us anywhere in the struggle for liberation. Look, there's the talk about the social death that is associated with racial discrimination has its points. But of course, it overlooks an awful lot of things, right? It overlooks, after a pessimistic argument, wants to basically argue that, no, blacks were not brought here for their labor. not for their economic potential. It has nothing to do with political economy. It simply has to do basically with this ontologically ingrained racism that characterizes modernity, if not more than that. That you can argue on factual grounds, just doesn't make I don't think makes a lot of sense. But, I'm from a Jewish background, okay? And I fought all my life against those who have tried to privilege the Holocaust as the exceptional event in human history. An event that happened in my grandparents' lifetime. Half of my grandparents' family were wiped out in the Holocaust. Any that didn't get out of Kolomaya in Western Ukraine by 1939 were not going to get out, okay? They don't even have a grave to mark where they fell. So the notion that racism meted out against blacks in general and Black Americans in particular represents an exceptional case that cannot be related or reduced or connected to the genocide against Native Americans or to Jews or to others around the world, which is a premise, basically the Afrocentric approach. It's just that I just think replicates some of the worst kind of particularism that you get with various forms of alternative nationalisms, including Zionism, frankly. So I think that motivated, I'll be generous enough to say that the Afrocentric position is motivated by acknowledging an objective problem, right? It arose out of Wilderson's stay in South Africa, right? He sees this promise of an anti-racist struggle that is supposedly going to deliver liberation, but an ANC, African National Congress, which essentially, in arguing for this multiracial coalition, does what? Well, it uses that multiracialism as a vehicle upon the end of apartheid to do what? To benefit the white existing minority class by allowing them to maintain economic power in exchange for surrendering some political power. So the disillusionment, this was a major disillusion. This was the most outstanding Black revolutionary struggle anywhere in the world that was demobilized in a matter of weeks by the ANC. Okay. Friends of mine, the PAC at the time said, Peter, we saw this coming happening 20 years ago. Why be surprised? Maybe they were right to have seen it coming, but the point is that it was a real blow to a lot of people in the international left to see the demobilization of the South African movement. So I think South Afro pessimism picks up from that moment of disappointment. Not all that dissimilar to how postmodernism and post-structuralism picks up from the disappointment of the moment of the failures of the movements of '68, to then weave a whole narrative out of that disappointment. I think that to go forward as a revolutionary, you have to build from the high points of freedom struggle that have been achieved, not from the low points of freedom struggle that have been aborted. This was also the mistake, I think, that was made by the Frankfurt School in Germany. You have to build from the high points of struggle and resistance that precede us in the past, and then to ask, where do we go from here on the basis of that? To proceed on the basis of defeats and to theorize and to develop a theory of defeat, it may be self-assuring. It may explain certain things that you can't explain otherwise. But in the final analysis, look, I'm not interested in Fanon for academic reasons. I'm interested in Fanon because I want to change the world. And I assume that those of you who are listening to this broadcast feel likewise, right? So what kind of perspective, what kind of philosophy is going to change the world? I think it's got to be a Marxist-based philosophy, but not a vulgar Marxist one. So we have to rethink what Marxism means for today based on what that would mean. And Fanon helps us do that immensely. Precisely maybe because he was looking as an outsider to that tradition and was trying to do something somewhat independent of it. And he brings a contribution that much Marxists have a lot to learn from. And most people on the left, of course, in general, have a lot to learn from. So, I'll just leave it there. There's a lot more you can say in the particulars of the pessimism debate. But I think that it's another version of shearing off the humanism of Fanon and taking some of his critical insights to heart. But I don't think Fanon was happy with that. Would have been happy with that. And what we know is, look, he adored Sartre. He, was thrilled when Sartre agreed to write the preface to The Wretched of the Earth. But from what we know in his last days of life, when he was shown the preface, he couldn't move at that point or even speak, I don't believe. But from what his wife communicated, he was not happy when he read that preface, because what Sartre made him into was an apostle of violence. And this was not what Fanon's message was, although he did support violence. His point was a new humanism, and that kind of drops out of Sartre's preface. So let's not repeat the same mistakes again.
Excellent. Professor Hudis, I really appreciate you coming on and discussing the real deep nuances of Fanon's work and having a contemporary discussion of race capitalism, politics, and revolutionary thought with us. I hope you'd be willing to come back again to talk about either some of your other writings or more in detail if we had a panel addressing this more comprehensively, these types of subject matters. We would love to have you on, and hopefully you'd be willing to do so.
I'll be more than glad to do so. This is a great questions and great discussion that we've had. And I look forward to participating as in the audience as well as any other way that you would like in your future meetings.
Well, I wanted to know if you'd be willing to come back. There's another professor. I don't know if you know of his work, Dylan Rodriguez. I think his most recent book is called White Reconstruction. He's a professor out of UC Riverside.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Also an abolitionist. Would love to have you guys come on and we can have another more roundtable discussion about the abolitionist framework. Because I think it's one of those things that gets in the weeds a little bit, because I think the wrong people are the ones that are having the conversation sometimes.
Yeah,
about
I agree. I can tell you about that.
So from what I've read already from you, and then from what we know about Dylan, who's been a guest on the show several times, I think it would be a great conversation, and we could take some real interesting deep dives into abolitionist thought, which is something that I definitely have picked up working with the unhoused. So I would love to do that if you're down. And also another thing I would really like to talk about is Marxist humanism, which is a concept that we don't hear about too often. As
and
everybody
then we'd have to do another one on your activism, since you mentioned that's you want to be considered an activist.
That's the main deal.
let's do one on that as well.
So thank you very much, Peter. You want to say goodnight, Phoenix? You want to say goodbye?
Yeah, that's a future. You got a future student running around.
This is your future student right here.
Oh, Phoenix. Hello, Phoenix. I'm Peter. You're cute.
Hi, Peter.
Got that right on the first swing.
Where are we going today, Phoenix?
I'm going today to fishes of the day.
We're going to see the fishes today, and what else?
Let's see the crocodile of the day.
No, we're going to see crocodiles. I think you're making that up. You're making up crocodiles. We're going to the aquarium.
Okay. Enjoy the crocodiles.
Thank you, Peter, very much. And thank you, Pascal Robert. Thank you, Marcus of the Left Flank Vets. And enjoy these soothing, hypnotic cartoons.
Saturday morning cartoon.